Our desire is to have better training at the local levels. Sometimes we struggle with our role as in-service leaders because we may not have been trained sufficiently, or perhaps the proper standards of measurement haven't been clarified. To assist in defining and clarifying our in-service roles, I'm going to interview two assistant administrators, Brother Chad Webb and Brother Richard Hawks, and they have also invited Kelly Shepard, the Director of Training Services, to share their insights on in-service standards. As they field some questions, let's look for some governing principles that will help us improve our in-service. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks.
It's good to have you here. We're going to start off with a simple question. Question number one is, who is responsible for in-service?
I'll take a stab at it first. I think one of the important things to realize is that the responsibility for in-service is a shared responsibility, both the individual and the leader. And both play an important part on the success of the in-service and the improvement of the teaching, I think. I think that when you look at who is ultimately responsible for the in-service, I'm reminded of something that's said in our Administering Appropriately Handbook under the section Provide Training. And it talks about who trains. It says that the area directors oversee training in their area. They assess needs, plan, and direct training with the assistance of training councils, seminary principals, institute directors, coordinators, and stake supervisors. It continues, under the direction of the area director, institute directors, seminary principals, and coordinators assess needs and oversee training for those they lead. They are assisted by in-service leaders, stake supervisors, committees, and mentors who plan and administer training at faculty, group, and individual levels.
Great.
I think part of that is the question is whether or not we should be delegating in-service to other people. And I think if I were the in-service leader, it wouldn't matter if I was an area director, a coordinator, a principal or director of an institute. I think I would take that responsibility just like I would take the responsibility to teach. You might delegate some things and have some people with expertise or certain skills that they want to demonstrate or ideas that they want to demonstrate. But if I'm that faculty principal, then each week I would prepare an in-service lesson just like I would prepare if I was a teacher of a course of seminary. And I would take that responsibility very seriously and make sure that I was prepared and that I oversaw what went on in that in-service and treated those teachers as my students that I had the responsibility to train and teach. And I would take that responsibility on myself, and certainly you'd include other people, but as the in-service leader of an area or a faculty, I wouldn't delegate that responsibility to someone else.
I think that's part of the assignment that's been given. There's been a trust extended to the principal, to the institute director, to the coordinator, the area director, and that part of that trust is really in-service and professional growth. So I think that needs to be taken seriously.
I think typically too that for our principals or directors, part of their work time is allocated for the in-servicing of their people, and so taking the time to observe teachers teach, to help them with their preparation, to plan and prepare for meetings and follow up on those meetings, it is part of their workload. And so the expectation is that they would devote some of their time outside of their teaching time to the thinking about and the preparing for good in-service.
Great. I think those comments really help clarify. Let's go to our next question. This question has two parts. First, what is the purpose of in-service?
Well,
go ahead, Chad.
The purpose of in-service is to improve teaching. So simply put, we don't want to just do it to have done in-service. We don't want to just put a check in a box and say, okay, we're done with in-service now. But like Richard referred to, it's part of a strategic plan for improving teaching. And so as the in-service leader, I should be observing classes. I should be making some assessments, some evaluations based on those observations. I should plan my in-service to help those that I'm training based on their needs, and it really should be with an outcome in mind of improving the experience for the students and not just having had an in-service class. I think it's a means to an end. The end is we want to have more impact in the classroom, and as a trainer we have the opportunity to influence how much impact we're having with our students. So I think that's the purpose.
Mm-hmm. Something that's mentioned also in the Administering Appropriately Handbook is that training is designed in church education to improve an individual's ability to apply correct principles, to understand and apply correct principles, and also to improve skills of teaching and administering. And so the purpose of our in-service ought to be focused on what principles, if understood and correctly applied, would increase the impact that occurs in the classroom or in our work with priesthood leaders or whatever it may be. And also, what skills do we need to help others better understand and practice and develop the ability to perform those much better, and have it become more of a habit type thing, their response and the way they use those skills. And I think there's some good help in the book on the difference between training principles and training skills, but both of those are a vital part of improving the effectiveness of our teachers and leaders in church education.
Hey, let me jump in with just another thought. I know your question is, what's the purpose of in-service? I think another part of that question is to ask, what do we in-service? What is it that we're offering? What do we teach? What do we train? Recently, I've thought about that question a lot because recently I was asked to do some in-service on that. And as I looked for an answer to how do we spend our time in service, I kind of landed on an answer that comes from Teaching the Gospel Handbook. In the section about what to teach, it suggests 3 things that we would consider when we talk about what we teach. The first one has to do with the intent of the inspired author. The second one, the needs and abilities of our students. And the third one, the impressions of the Holy Ghost. And even though that's specific to teaching, I think when we think about in-service, I would consider the same 3 things. I think if we were to consider the intent of the inspired author, we'd have to look at things like what Elder Kerr has been teaching us these last few years about impact and exposure. Certainly as an in-service leader, I would take the inspired direction of my leaders and make sure that that was communicated to the people that I serve and in service. I think I would use TIP, the Teaching Improvement Package. I would certainly use the teaching emphasis materials. The second part, of course, the needs and abilities of our students. I would look at that just like I would in a classroom. If I've been observing teachers and I see that the teachers that I'm working with on my faculty have certain needs, then I would try to address those in service, and I would try to prepare lessons and training based on those needs. But that's not to say that in-service at an institute would be made up of special interest topics that the teachers choose. No matter how much experience the group has, in-service still should be used to improve the experience of the students by improving our teaching. There's an excellent model of this on the Teaching Emphasis DVD with the Cedar City faculty. That's a group of experienced and very capable teachers, and yet their institute director, as their in-service leader, made sure that they used their time to deepen their understanding of effective teaching so that they could improve. It's really a good model of how we should be using our in-service time. I just think that none of us are at a point that we wouldn't benefit from learning from one another about teaching more effectively, or from a study and from practice with the teaching emphasis. And then, of course, the last one, and I hope we would never just give a token nod to the promptings of the Holy Ghost, but that we would really look for and search after the promptings of the Holy Ghost prayerfully and pondering in our preparations so that we could respond to those promptings to meet the needs of our people. So I think our purpose is, the question's a good one. The purpose of our in-service is to improve teaching. How we go about that and what we train, I think there's a lot to this question that we could talk about, but that's where I would start, is with those ideas from the what to teach in Teaching the Gospel Handbook.
I just think one other thought. All of us join together in service to help each other. And we bring together so many different talents and skills that when we do help each other, we'll be a lot stronger.
Great. Thank you. I think that helps understand a little more the purpose of in-service. Let's go to the part 2 of this question. Are there some topics of in-service training that should be trained regularly?
Well, I think there are. Like in any skill, there are some basics that have to be visited over and over again. And I think every year, it's someone like you've been talking about sports, but they review those basics year after year after year and never get away from the basics. I think you could select from a handful of items and teach them year after year.
Do you remember Elder Irene saying that to make big changes, he would make small changes in things we do often? I think as an in-service leader, I would identify the most fundamental elements of effective teaching things that have nothing to do with personality or style, but that every effective teacher incorporates. Things like teaching by the Spirit, leading an effective discussion, asking good questions, student participation, just things that I think everybody could incorporate on some level. Loving your students, just basic fundamental things to effective teaching. And I would talk about those often. I would come back to them, especially as a coordinator with teacher turnover of volunteer teachers. To assume that you've trained it once and 3 years later you've already done that and you're done is probably not a good way of thinking, because there's new teachers every year. But even if it is teachers who have taught for a number of years, I think, like Kelly says, there's some fundamental things that you just need to go back and revisit and reevaluate. And I would stop. My examples maybe weren't the best ones, but I would think about what are the core elements of effective teaching that everybody needs to understand and do well, and that everybody could improve on. And I would go back and visit those often and work on those fundamentals.
I do want to say one thing that I think ought to be trained every year, or at least discussed, is the charted course for religious educators by President J. Reuben Clark. I think there's time that we have to devote every year to revisiting that and keeping our bearings straight, our course straight as to what it is we're about in church education, and I think that's worth looking at every year.
All right, let's go to our final question. Are there some additional guidelines or principles we can give for the length and frequency of local in-service?
That's an interesting question, because there's so many different circumstances. I think obviously if you could be consistent, I think our expectation, our hope would be that you could have monthly in-service for volunteer teachers and weekly in-service for full-time teachers. But I think it depends on travel distances. I think it depends on a lot of factors that only a person in the local situation could understand. And so depending on what's realistic for people and how much they can gather together without causing too much undue pressure on a volunteer teacher to meet and get that training, knowing that they still have to prepare lessons and things. But I don't think it's unrealistic in most situations to expect them to meet monthly while they're teaching. And maybe more often while they're not, in the summer months when they're not having to prepare a lesson for the next day. With our full-time people, though, I think an expectation of once a week and, an hour and a half, or I don't know what the expectation would be, but that you would spend some time and really have a formal in-service with a prepared instructor, with people coming to the meeting ready and prepared for what's going to take place, and working on implementing the things that they're trained on and reporting on those things.
What we'd really like to see happen is in-service meetings on a consistent basis. The more often we could meet, the better it would be.
We might even want to be, in some cases, a little creative in our in-service approach, use technology a little bit more. We have places around the world where people have to take public transportation and for hours to get to places, and maybe we could look at meeting less often and longer when we do meet, maybe on a Saturday. Or maybe we use technology, even a telephone, to be able to provide some of the in-service, or at least some of the communication, so that we can deal with some of the business of being a part of seminaries and institutes without expecting them to be away from their families so much, or some of those things. I think if we understand the principle and the expectation, then we can adjust to the local circumstance to meet the needs, to give the training that's needed, but also be realistic in what we expect of our volunteers.
I think in-service leaders have to be careful to look at the different things that they could do and say, if I can realistically get them together, it's a good idea without a lot of waste of expense on their part or time. But it may be wise to look at some ways to do it where they're not gathering together.
I just think the spirit of what Richard said is really good. How can we help them? How can we assist them? And it may not be the most help to require more of a volunteer at a particular time of the year or whatever the circumstance may be. The goal of in-service is to help them be better teachers, to have more impact, to bless the students' lives. And however we do that, I think we need to be a little bit flexible and understanding and apply those principles of consistency and follow up the best we can within the limitations given by the reality of people's lives and circumstances. So I really appreciate that comment.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been great to hear your comments and examples and ideas. To close, we'd like to just summarize some principles for in-service. First, area directors, institute directors, principals, and coordinators have the responsibility to oversee in-service and should be the primary leaders of the in-service to best meet the needs of those they supervise. Next, in order to improve teaching and provide effective training, local in-service should be held on a regular basis, as often as is reasonably possible based upon the type of assignment one has in CES. Also, local in-service that focuses on teacher improvement as the primary purpose and incorporates content mastery and some administrative business will help make a giant leap forward in what happens in the classroom. Finally, teaching will improve when local in-service leaders provide training based upon an assessment using primarily CS materials and handbooks, revisiting some basic principles of teaching as needed. We invite you to take these principles and apply them in your roles of in-service leaders. We sure appreciate our panel discussion today, having our administrators and our director of training here with us. Thanks, and thanks for being with us.